No fame, just a fortune.
He was a revolutionary hero, but not a military man. He was known as America's schoolmaster. He was Noah Webster. From the beginning, English was the language of the colonies. Even in the 18th century, with its large influx of Dutch, Africans, French, and Germans, there was always one language, English, not dominated by dialects, and never degenerating into pidgin English as occurred in the West Indies. With the colonial period ended, the United States sought to standardize its language so that all people could express themselves and participate in the developing American character. There was a great push among many to produce an American English, and the high priest of this cause was Noah Webster. In 1783, at the incredibly young age of 25, Noah published A Grammatical Institute of the English Language, which was known by most people simply as the Blue-Backed Speller, because of its blue cover. Eventually, the book would sell over 1 million copies per year. And for over 100 years, it taught American children how to read, spell, and pronounce words. Benjamin Franklin applauded Webster's
the zeal for preserving the purity of our language, both in its expressions and pronunciation, and in correcting the popular errors several of our states are continually falling into with respect to both.
A little over 40 years after the Blue-Backed Speller appeared, Noah Webster published his American Dictionary of the English Language, the first dictionary of the American language. Webster wanted to create an American English, not an English of purity, and he did. However, the quest for uniformity in America's English continues today. But because of men like Noah Webster, there is one and only one language in America, English. With the Revolutionary War over, the new United States faced many peacetime issues. Should it have a standing army? Should it issue paper money? How strong should the central government be? But perhaps the most important issue was what to do about the settlement of lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. To answer the last question, Congress passed 2 laws: the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Essentially, these laws would become the nation's land policy for the next 100 years. Known as the Old Northwest Territory, this region north of the Ohio River was a vast wilderness inhabited largely by Native Americans, squatters, and Frenchmen, all guarded by a few aging forts. The 2 statutes devised a blueprint for the region's orderly settlement. The 85 Act mandated that the land be surveyed and divided into 6-mile square units called townships, townships that are still in use today. In these 36-mile sections, 4 were to be set aside for the federal government, and 1 for educational purposes. The 1787 ordinance laid the ground rules for transition from territory to statehood. At first, the territory would be ruled by a federally appointed governor. When the population reached 60,000 inhabitants, the citizens could write their own constitution and apply for statehood. Once admitted, following Jefferson's ideal, the new state would be equal to the original 13. 5 new states were carved from this region: Ohio in 1803, Indiana in 1816, Illinois in 1818, Michigan in 1837, and Wisconsin in 1848. Interestingly, the Northwest Ordinance was the last and perhaps the most significant of the 12-year-old Continental Congress's acts. Passed during the Constitutional Convention, it treated American territorial expansion as though it were a large real estate deal, protecting speculators and promoters. Yet at the same time, it banned slavery, guaranteed civil rights and religious liberty, and promised eventual equality with the other states instead of perpetual colonial servitude.
I hold it that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. It is the medicine necessary for the sound health of government. God forbid that we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. Thomas Jefferson, January 30th, 1787.
When Thomas Jefferson wrote those words, he referred to an uprising of western Massachusetts farmers in the fall of 1786. Led by a former Continental Army captain, Daniel Shays, these angry farmers took control of the Springfield, Massachusetts County Courthouse from September 25th through the 28th. More hostilities followed. The problem was that politicians in Boston were behaving much like their former British masters, imposing unfair property and polling taxes, perverting the legal system, and capitalizing on an unstable currency. The result was that heroes who fought for independence were losing their farms and being thrown into debtor prison. The new country was at a critical moment in history. Would it go down the path of one more corrupt and malevolent government, or would something new and grand emerge?
No morning ever dawned more favorable than ours did, and no day was ever more clouded than the present. Wisdom and good examples are necessary at this time to rescue the political machine from the impending storm.
Eventually, Massachusetts militia put down Shays' rebellion. Shays and most of his men received amnesty, but no event better dramatized the need for a strong national government to ensure justice and domestic tranquility, the need for a new U.S. Constitution, and the need to spell out the rights of every citizen, to protect those rights always. In the summer of 1787, that new government would take form. It was a daring move like none before or since. These men and women of the United States were about to replace their old government with a new one, and do so without a single shot being fired. By 1787, most of the country recognized that the
Articles of Confederation enacted in 1777
could not solve the problems facing the new nation. Under the Articles, the United States government had no independent power of taxation. It was unable to deal with incursions by the British and Spanish into its territories, and it could not regulate commerce between the various states. The United States behaved more like a group of petty nations than a single powerful country. In 1787, the Congress sanctioned the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia's Independence Hall. Chaired by George Washington and including the elderly Ben Franklin and youthful James Madison, its mission was to create a new governmental structure. Throughout the long, hot summer, this extraordinary gathering of talent debated resolution after resolution, honing the structure of a representative government until on September 17th, the delegates approved the U.S. Constitution. The preamble began, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." 7 articles followed. The central feature of the new Constitution, and its most brilliant design, was its separation of powers into 3 branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. All of them interlocked in a system of checks and balances. Article 1 established a bicameral or 2-part legislature with a House of Representatives based on proportional representation and a Senate based on equal representation. It also provided that the states determined the manner in which members would be elected. The article went on to list the powers of the Congress, including the power to lay and collect taxes, borrow money, regulate commerce, and provide for the common defense. Only the 2 houses of Congress could initiate legislation, and the article detailed how a bill became law. Article 2 established the executive branch of government. Both the president and the vice president had to be 35 years of age and natural-born American citizens. The president was the commander-in-chief of the army and the state's militias. With the advice and consent of the Senate, he was empowered to make treaties with other nations and choose judges. To balance the power of Congress, he was given the authority to veto bills. Finally, the article provided for the removal of the president. Article 3 vested the judicial power of the United States in one Supreme Court and directed Congress to establish such lesser courts as needed. It also defined what cases could be handled by the federal judiciary and stipulated that all crimes except impeachment shall be by jury. Article 4 stipulated that each state shall honor the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. For example, a marriage in one state must be recognized by all states. The framers, understanding that the document would have to be improved from time to time to reflect a changing and growing nation, wrote Article 5 in order to establish procedures for amending the Constitution. Article 6 made the Constitution the supreme law of the land. It also enumerated the United States' responsibilities and required that all federal officers take an oath of allegiance to the United States and the Constitution. Article 7 outlined the manner of ratification of the Constitution, stating that 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution. Over the next year, the people of the various states in their own conventions debated and voted on the proposed Constitution. During this time, Constitutional advocates Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay wrote the Federalist Papers, which laid out a defense for the necessity of a strong federal government as proposed by the new Constitution. On June 21st, 1788, New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify the Constitution, and with that, the bold new experiment in self-government was about to begin. At the outset of the Revolutionary War, John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail that Washington's appointment as commander-in-chief would have a great effect in cementing and securing the union of these colonies. Having chaired the Constitutional Convention in 1787 made George Washington the perfect choice to head the new union. In fact, Washington, by tacit agreement, was the only man ever considered for the post. However, Washington demurred at first. He was 56 and his health was failing. His Virginia plantation, Mount Vernon, long neglected through the war years, needed his supervision, but the people wanted him as a man of virtue and trust. A favorite 4th of July toast in 1788 went, "Farmer Washington, may he, like a second Cincinnatus, be called from the plow to rule a great people." But Hamilton and Jefferson, though politically and philosophically opposed, spoke with Washington at length of the necessity that he be the first president. Finally, they convinced him to accept office. Washington was elected unanimously, the only chief executive to have that honor. His reception was that of a Greek hero as he rode northward from his Virginia plantation to New York City. At last, he was given the oath of office in New York on April 30th, 1789. In his inaugural address, Washington's theme was that the United States could not have accomplished the goal of independence in its unique Constitution without the hand of Providence. His vice president was John Adams, who would succeed him as the second president of the United States. The U.S. Constitution, written in 1787, laid out a unique structure for a strong central government. But it also left open the door for tyranny by that government. Fresh in the minds of Americans of that time was the loss of their civil rights during British rule. In fact, many of the states consented to ratify the Constitution only with the provision that there would be a Bill of Rights for U.S. citizens. To fulfill this obligation, James Madison drafted the Bill of Rights and presented it to the Congress on June 8, 1789. In 1791, they were ratified by the states and became the law of the land. In recent years, the First and Second Amendments have become the most controversial issues of the Constitution. Amendment 1. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Amendment 2. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The Fourth Amendment safeguarded the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures, except with a search warrant issued upon probable cause. The Fifth Amendment, arguably the most prominent of them all, protected citizens from forfeiting life, liberty, or property without due process in the courts. It also provided safeguards against being tried for the same crime twice, forcing a defendant to testify against her or himself, and from property being confiscated for public use without proper compensation. The Sixth Amendment guaranteed a speedy trial, an impartial jury, and the right to confront witnesses, and the right to a lawyer. Other amendments forbade the quartering of troops in private homes during peacetime and excessive bail and cruel or unusual punishments. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly to the framers of the Constitution, Amendments 9 and 10 guaranteed to the people those rights not specifically enumerated in the Constitution. Oddly, the drafter of these rights, James Madison, originally opposed the Bill of Rights because he feared that by listing them, others not explicitly named would be denied to citizens. But time has shown that the Bill of Rights has become the cornerstone of America's much heralded freedom. As the last decade of the 18th century opened, America's colonial period had come to an end. The new nation had a remarkable constitution, and its growing population was expanding westward into the lush Ohio Valley. But one crucial question remained. What kind of economic structure would the United States embrace? One person almost single-handedly provided the answer. He was Alexander Hamilton. On September 11th, 1789, George Washington named Alexander Hamilton the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury. For the next 6 years, Hamilton would define the country's economic and fiscal policies and create its financial institutions. Hamilton began quickly, and in 1790 launched an ambitious plan for handling the nation's debt, which included assumption by the federal government of the state's war costs. His second step was to create the Bank of the United States, which became the mechanism for establishing credit for the country. Next, in 1791, and through the tireless campaigning of Noah Webster, under Hamilton's guidance, Congress passed the Copyright and Patent Act to protect American inventors. In that same year, Hamilton presented a report to Congress which urged tariffs on foreign imports to protect American industry and agriculture. He also recommended that the federal government support road and canal construction to provide the infrastructure necessary to enhance the economy. Finally, in 1792, the United States Mint was established and a uniformed coinage produced. As a corollary to Hamilton's federal plans, in 1792, the New York Stock Exchange was organized by friends of Hamilton to fund new business. Hamilton envisioned a United States diverse in manufacturing and, in his own words, independent of foreign nations for military and other essential supplies. By the time he left the Treasury in 1795, the country had taken all the steps necessary to join the Industrial Revolution. Hamilton's vision would win out over the Jeffersonian agricultural utopia, and America would go on to become the greatest industrial power in the world. Ironically, Alexander Hamilton would lose his life over these values. In 1804, he died as a result of gunshot wounds inflicted in a duel with his old political nemesis, Aaron Burr. When Benjamin Franklin, at the age of 84, died on April 17, 1790, the era of America's founding ended as well. Franklin, more than anyone else, can be said to be the father of the nation. In many ways, everything after his death was an expansion of what he pioneered. No life symbolized the American experience better than his. No one demonstrated the American genius for invention and enterprise in bolder terms. Benjamin Franklin was the quintessential American and a true Renaissance man. Born in Boston in 1706, he moved to Philadelphia and started work as a printer. In 1729, he bought the Philadelphia Gazette and remained its editor until 1766. He wrote many books, including Poor Richard's Almanac, which became the most popular of all colonial almanacs. In it, Benjamin Franklin introduced the character Poor Richard, who spouted such sayings as, "Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise." Poor Richard's philosophy was the new American ideal of how the poor man may improve himself by hard work, thrift, and honesty. At the age of 65, Franklin wrote his autobiography, which many scholars consider the first great book of American literature. Franklin's scientific observations and practical inventions gained him fame throughout America and Europe. His experiments with electricity led to his invention of the lightning rod. Because of his poor eyesight, he invented bifocal lenses. The need to heat homes efficiently and safely gave him the idea for the Franklin stove. An accomplished musician, he also invented a musical instrument, which he called the glass harmonica, played by touching dampened fingers to the edges of spinning glasses. Mozart and Beethoven composed tunes for it. In the centuries that followed, other famous inventors like Thomas Edison and Cyrus McCormick would retrace Franklin's footsteps, inventing new tools and machines that made people's lives easier. Franklin was one of Philadelphia's richest men, and he used his wealth to give back to his community for all that it had given him. He helped found the first Pennsylvania hospital and a college that would later become the University of Pennsylvania. Perhaps Franklin's greatest accomplishments were as a statesman and diplomat. Franklin was the only one of the founding fathers who signed the three defining documents of the United States: the Declaration of Independence, the Treaty of Paris ending the Revolutionary War, and the Constitution. At a time of life when most people were growing more conservative, Franklin became more radical. In 1787, at the age of 81, he was named president of the nation's first abolitionist society. Had he lived in a future century, he would have seen the fruition of his own genius and prophecy.
The rapid progress of the sciences makes me at times sorry that I was born so soon. Imagine the power man will have over matter a few hundred years from now. We may learn how to remove gravity from large masses and float them over large distances. Agriculture will double its produce with less labor. All diseases will surely be cured, even old age. If only the moral sciences could be improved as well, perhaps man would cease to be wolves to one another, and human beings could learn to be human.
Benjamin Franklin was the consummate American, and it is upon his shoulders that the foundations of the American dream rest. This small monument outside of Washington, D.C. is a tribute to Benjamin Banneker. But in a way, this city of monuments, this grand national capital, is a tribute to this astonishing American. The U.S. Congress mandated that the nation create a new federal city. A site was chosen by George Washington on the Potomac River. Maryland and Virginia ceded land to the federal government, and the well-known New York architect Charles Pierre L'Enfant was given the assignment of designing the nation's capital city. In early 1792, the temperamental and headstrong L'Enfant quarreled with the commissioners overseeing the project, and the two sides quickly reached an impasse. L'Enfant resigned, taking the plans for Washington, D.C. with him. Fortunately, Benjamin Banneker, who was part of the D.C. survey team, reproduced the plans from memory. And we have the splendor that is the national capital today. Benjamin Banneker was the first of a long line of black American scientists and inventors. Fascinated by mechanical devices, at the age of 21, Banneker took a watch apart to study its design. Later he built the first striking clock to be manufactured completely in America. He next studied astronomy, and his predictions of solar and lunar eclipses were so accurate that they became a standard feature of his best-selling almanac. Many African Americans have traveled on the path Banneker founded. George Washington Carver, Granville T. Woods, and George Carruthers, who as a child was so inspired by Banneker that he went on to become one of the nation's leading aerospace engineers. In the 21st century, the reverberations from the arrival of the first black slaves to the Jamestown colony in 1619 have not subsided. The greatest failure of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is that they did not end slavery. In fact, the Constitution began a process that would nearly tear the country apart. The northern and mid-Atlantic states understood the hypocrisy of fighting a war of freedom and at the same time owning slaves. By the end of the Revolutionary War, those states had abolished involuntary servitude. But the southern states had no qualms about continuing slavery. Charles Pinckney of South Carolina defended the South's peculiar institution warmly.
In all ages, 1/2 of mankind have been slaves.
John Rutledge of Virginia was more direct.
North and South Carolina and Georgia would never agree to a new constitution unless their right to import slaves be untouched. The people of those states will never be such fools as give up so important an interest.
The southern plantation owners realized that northern states would become safe havens for runaway slaves, and they demanded a provision in the Constitution that required northern states to treat slaves as criminals to be extradited back to their state of origin.
Article 4, Section 2 of the United States Constitution
declared that persons held to service or labor, a euphemism for slavery, in one state escaping into another shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. However, the Constitution did not set up a mechanism for carrying out the law. The result was that in 1793, Congress passed a law called the Fugitive Slave Act that outlined how Article 4, Section 2 would be executed. Although the law was largely ineffectual, it began a process that would split the nation apart 68 years later in the Civil War, that would be the bloodiest war in American history. Though the war's outcome would cement the nation back together, it did not end the schism between North and South, black and white, a schism which still haunts the United States today. In the summer of 1794, George Washington, now President and Commander-in-Chief of the newly formed United States, once again took the reins of a 12,000-man army. The enemy? A group of farmers near Pittsburgh who turned surplus grain into whiskey. Accompanying Washington on the march into western Pennsylvania was his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. The reason for the federal government's impressive display of force wasn't a moral objection to alcohol, but the fact that the farmers refused to pay a steep federal liquor tax initiated by Hamilton. In 1791, Alexander Hamilton had pushed through Congress a 25% excise tax on whiskey to be collected at the source. Federal tax collectors had to face these frontier farmers, known as the Whiskey Boys, on their own lands. Over the next 3 years, confrontations between the farmers and the tax collectors grew more and more violent, until a large portion of western Pennsylvania was in revolt against the tax. When Washington and his troops arrived, the troublemakers dispersed and the rebellion disintegrated. Accommodations were made with the ringleaders. But the significance of the Whiskey Rebellion and the federal government's intervention was that a precedent was set. By being lenient with the Whiskey Boys, the new federal government showed its capacity to rule resolutely, but with mercy. Over the next 200 years, the seemingly limitless freedom of American society would from time to time lead to violent protests and rebellions. In 1863, Irish immigrants and U.S. citizens rioted against the new draft initiated by Lincoln. A strike at Pittsburgh Homestead Steel Mill in 1892 led to bloodshed and was finally put down by the Pennsylvania militia. In 1932, at the height of the Depression, veterans marched on Washington, D.C. General Douglas MacArthur, on orders from President Hoover, crushed the protest. The infamous summer of 1965 saw America's inner cities torn apart with riots from Los Angeles to Detroit to Miami. And by the end of the decade, nationwide protests against the Vietnam War, often put down brutally by police and soldiers, would end American participation in the conflict. But these protests and rebellions did not tear the country apart. In fact, often they made the country stronger, showing the true value of freedom. By 1793, Europe was once again at war, and the new United States now faced its first diplomatic dilemma. Would America be pulled into another European conflict? Or could the nation, as Thomas Paine had hoped, stay clear of European hostilities? Most people in the U.S. government favored remaining neutral. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson believed that neutrality could be used to gain concessions from Britain, and to a certain extent, his strategy worked. President Washington sent John Jay, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, to England to negotiate concessions from Britain in return for American neutrality. By the end of 1794, Jay gained trade and territory concessions favorable to the U.S. in what became known as the Jay Treaty. Britain agreed to give up any posts it had retained in the old Northwest Territory in exchange for paying debts owed to Britain by American citizens. U.S. merchants also gained the right to trade to the Caribbean. However, Jay failed on several points that rankled many Americans. The U.S. was prohibited from exporting many goods to Europe on American ships. Southerners felt particularly slighted, since with the invention of the cotton gin, they had hoped to ship cotton directly to Europe. Most troublesome, though, was Britain's refusal to give up the right of impressment. This practice of removing sailors from American ships would eventually lead to the War of 1812 between the U.S. and Britain. However, a year later, in the Treaty of San Lorenzo, American negotiator Thomas Pinckney proved much more successful. Fearful that Britain and the United States would conspire to launch an attack on Louisiana and Florida, Spanish negotiators gave to Pinckney everything the United States asked for: free navigation of the Mississippi River, permission for American traders to deposit goods in New Orleans, and acceptance that the new nation's western boundary was the Mississippi River and the southern boundary was the 31st parallel. Because of these two treaties, in 1795 both Spain and Britain recognized United States sovereignty over the western territory won in the Revolutionary War, clearing the way for western expansion. In 1796, when George Washington declared 2 terms as president was enough, a great fear welled up in the hearts and minds of many Americans over the upcoming election. Washington had been a mythic figure, and his retirement inevitably produced a question of succession, as in England when a king died. Many predicted that the country would be torn apart by the political strife between Federalists and Republicans.
I fear the country is not sufficiently united to make a choice by the electors. Oliver Wolcott, Secretary of the Treasury.
While Washington had stood above politics in the minds of many Americans, those who served under him, like Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, directed strong party factions that opposed each other ideologically. Led by Hamilton and Adams, the Federalists thought a strong national government was the only way the United States could survive. Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison, believed in states' rights and a limited central government. Hamilton saw a strong national government as the means to make the separate states into a powerful nation. While Adams had fought bravely and tirelessly for freedom from Britain, he believed that America should follow British ideals in government. Jefferson's republic beliefs were based upon his faith in an agrarian utopia. More practical than Jefferson, Madison feared a strong federal government would coerce the states into making laws that were to their own detriment. The result was that in a few short years, a two-party system emerged which pitted the heroes of America's fight for freedom against each other, an event the framers of the Constitution never foresaw. Partisan politics came to a head in the election of 1796 when Adams was elected president and Jefferson, his opposition, was elected vice president. This juxtaposition produced an uncomfortable situation that would be remedied in 1803, when the 12th Amendment designated that both executive officers would be from the same party. However, since the election of 1796, the two-party system has become the primary form of political debate in the United States. Over the next 200 years, the parties themselves would change ideals and principles and, at times, even names. Until in the 21st century, Republicans and Democrats battled just as Adams and Jefferson did over 200 years ago. But most importantly, the transition of power in 1796 took place smoothly, as it has ever since, demonstrating that the fears of the 96 election were unfounded. The USS Constitution, America's most famous warship, now sits in Boston Harbor, a testament to the valor and skill of a fledgling U.S. Navy, born in the last decade of the 18th century. In 1793, Britain and France once again went to war. On the high seas, neither side respected United States neutrality. It was clear that America needed a military to protect its frontiers, as well as unfettered trade and commercial shipping interests. While the Army and militia primarily functioned on an as-needed basis, a Navy required permanent ships, officers, and crew. In 1794, Congress authorized the establishment of a Navy, with the building of 6 frigates. The first of these ships, the USS Constitution, known as Old Ironsides because bullets bounced off its tough oak planking, was launched from Boston Harbor in 1797. The ship carried 50 guns and a crew of more than 450. This small beginning of the American Navy would have tremendous payoffs in the War of 1812. The Constitution would be involved in 2 classic battles between British ships, winning both. Other American ships also defeated the British warships, and bolstering the morale of the American Navy and enhancing its reputation. Britain, the country of Drake and Nelson, had her nose bloodied by the infant United States Navy. America's modern military was completed by the establishment of the Marine Corps in 1798. The Corps would serve gloriously through the next 200 years. As the 18th century came to an end, the U.S. military was poised to protect America's frontier as well as commerce throughout the world. As the 18th century was coming to a close, the nation experienced its first crisis in freedom, a freedom it had wrested from Great Britain 17 years earlier, freedom of press and speech. The framers of the Constitution understood that monarchs and tyrannies maintained power by prohibiting any criticism of their rule. So the framers explicitly provided for open criticism of the government through the First Amendment. Still, there have always been those tempted to abuse the power of the federal government. The first time arose in 1798 after France and Britain had renewed their centuries-old conflict. The Federalists sided with Britain and the Republicans supported France. Led by John Adams, the Federalists attempted to restrict criticism aimed at their policies by their Republican rivals. In the summer of 1798, a Federalist-dominated Congress passed some of the most repressive measures ever enacted by the U.S. government. 2 alien acts directly targeted immigrants thought to be sympathetic with Republican ideals, making it harder for those aliens to become citizens, and giving the president power to deport anyone considered dangerous to the welfare of the country. The Sedition Act directly targeted Republican political activity. The act fined and imprisoned anyone conspiring with any intent to oppose any laws of the government or presenting opposition through
printing, writing, or speaking in a scandalous or malicious way against the government of the United States, either House of Congress or the President, with the purpose of bringing them into contempt.
The majority of the American public so roundly hated the Alien and Sedition Acts that they turned the Federalists out of office by electing Thomas Jefferson in 1800. The new Republican government, led by Jefferson, repealed the Alien Acts and allowed the Sedition Act to expire, ending a dark era in American history. However, Americans would now have to be ever vigilant, especially in wartime, as many attempts would be made by Congress and the presidency to restrict individual freedom. These have included the Espionage Act of 1917, the War Powers Act of 1941, and the Patriot Act of 2001. It was fitting that the United States government's last official event of the 18th century was a eulogy in Congress for George Washington. On December 26, 1799, General Henry Light Horse Harry Lee, Washington's brilliant cavalry commander in the Revolutionary War, delivered words of praise that would be remembered through the centuries.
First in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen.
Washington's life mirrored the indomitable spirit of the United States. At the young age of 24, he earned a commission as a colonel in the French and Indian War. 20 years later, his steady resolve virtually willed America to triumph on the battlefield of the Revolution. After victory, he shepherded the formation of a new constitution and went on to become the country's first president. Like many other great American leaders such as Jefferson, Lincoln, and Roosevelt, Washington's legacy was not limited to what he accomplished in his long years of public service, but included the vision he set for the nation's future. Washington set forth his vision in his farewell address, delivered 3 years before his death on December 14, 1799. This speech has become one of the most cherished American documents. Washington spoke of values that would transform America into a great nation. Foremost was unity.
With slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. You have a common cause fought and triumphed together. The independence and liberty you possess are the work of joint councils and joint efforts of common dangers, sufferings, and successes. The unity of government, which constitutes you as one people, is also now dear to you. It is justly so, for it is a main pillar in the edifice of your real independence, the support of your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, of your safety, of your prosperity, of that very liberty which you so highly prize.
But Washington also warned against regional discriminations that would tear the country apart and urged further separation from the ways of European politics. His demand for neutrality would become the benchmark for America's European foreign policy in the 19th century. A policy that would allow the country to grow into a self-sufficient industrial, military, and intellectual power on the world stage of the 20th and 21st centuries. With his passing, all of America mourned. Abigail Adams summed up the nation's respect for Washington, and by doing so praised the new nation as well.
Possessed of power, possessed of an extensive influence, he never used it but for the benefit of his country. When assailed by faction, when reviled by party, he suffered with dignity.
In 1800, the city was a meager conglomeration of scaffolded buildings and crude hovels connected by muddy roads. A village built out of grandiose and as yet unfinished dreams. Hardly anything about this city suggested authority and power, democracy and freedom. Today, Washington, D.C. is one of the world's great capitals. Resplendent in architecture and monuments, it shines with the promise of democracy. It is a city which never sleeps. The corridors of power echo with footsteps. Yet its humble origins did not suggest such beauty or power. In 1790, the leaders of the new nation understood that the place of government representing the new United States had to be greater than any state capital, nor could the center of power for the United States be tucked away in some corner of an existing city like New York or Philadelphia, as occurred in Europe. Never before had any nation built a capital city from scratch. From its inception, the aura of America's capital embodied the promise of democracy inherent in the nation's founding. The idea of a national capital originated as early as 1783 at a meeting of Congress in Philadelphia. On June 20th of that year, a group of unpaid soldiers of the Revolution marched on Philadelphia to air their grievances before Congress. As a result, a number of congressmen started a movement to establish a federal city. Several locations were considered, but disagreements between the northern states and those of the South delayed the decision. In 1791, George Washington recommended a site along the Potomac River that he believed would finally appease both sides. Situated equally between them, the District of Columbia stood as a gateway to the western frontier. Once selected, Washington negotiated with Pierre Charles L'Enfant to lay out a plan for the new city. The capital's cornerstone was laid by George Washington in September 1793, and construction was begun. In October 1800, the government was ready to move into the new capital. President John Adams took up residence in the White House, and senators and representatives moved into the domed Capitol building. Adams, feeling the sanctity of the presidential mansion, wrote his wife,
I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house, and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof.
And in this city, less than 5 months later, this young country survived one of the most crucial tests that can face a new nation. For the first time in modern history, an incumbent political party, the Federalists, had accepted electoral defeat and turned over the government to its opponents, Jeffersonian Republicans. On March 4, 1801, one observer wrote, as Jefferson replaced Adams,
I have this morning witnessed one of the most interesting scenes a free people can ever witness. The changes of administration, which in every government and in every age have most generally been epochs of confusion, villainy, and bloodshed. In this, our happy country takes place without any species of distraction or disorder.
However, until the introduction of new technologies like the steam engine and telegraph, there seemed to be a constant agitation to move the new capital because of its remoteness and inaccessibility. But today, the country's capital stands as a tribute to the greatness of a nation. The wisdom of its creation is evident in the splendor of present-day Washington, D.C. It was described by one observer at the time as
the most significant event to our country since the Declaration of Independence.
It involved a largely uninhabited land of tall grass, prairie, and mountains, but in one fell swoop it doubled the size of the United States, catapulting the fledgling nation into a world power. It was the Louisiana Purchase. In January of 1803, wishing to secure safe and open navigation from the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to the Atlantic Ocean, President Jefferson sent James Monroe to join Robert Livingston in Paris with orders to negotiate for the purchase of New Orleans. The year before, the Spanish official in charge of the port of New Orleans had stopped the right of deposit, preventing American farmers from warehousing their produce and goods in New Orleans for transshipment to the Atlantic. President Jefferson declared,
It is New Orleans through which the produce of 3/8 of our territory must pass to market. France, placing herself on that door, assumes to us an attitude of defiance.
Ceded in 1762 to Spain, French Louisiana was returned to France in 1800 by the Treaty of Ile-de-France. Napoleon Bonaparte had planned a French empire in the New World with its center at New Orleans. But by 1803 his plans had been shattered. A large army he sent to the Caribbean island of Santo Domingo was destroyed by revolt and yellow fever. Threatened with a new war in Europe, Napoleon suddenly offered the entire territory of Louisiana for sale.
I renounce Louisiana. It is not only New Orleans that I will cede, it is the whole colony without reservation.
The Louisiana Territory was a huge chunk of land, ranging from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains to the border of modern-day Canada. In total, 828,000 square miles. When Jefferson got word of the sale offer, he had to act quickly. But the country had no precedent for dealing with such matters, and strict interpretation of the federal Constitution did not cover it. After much agonizing, he made the deal. The Louisiana Purchase in May of 1803 was bought for $15 million. In an instant, the United States doubled in size. In the same instant, the United States became a world power. The West was now open. The lands of Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas were immediately available for expansion and settlement. Soon to follow would be the riches of the Rocky Mountains, and the U.S. was poised to take control of the northern part of the Spanish Empire and extend its claim all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Just as important as the acquisition of new land was the Louisiana Purchase's impact on the new federal government. By using his powers of office in purchasing the land, Jefferson extended the executive powers of the presidency. His actions initiated the idea of implied powers in the Constitution. Ironically, though Jefferson was a strict constructionalist, he used implied powers in order to justify his action in purchasing the new lands. On Independence Day in 1803, he announced the purchase of the Louisiana Territory to the nation. Without the purchase of the Louisiana Territory, it is possible that the United States would have remained a small country east of the Mississippi, bounded by the Spanish Empire west and south. In January of 1803, President Jefferson requested from Congress money to finance an expedition into the uncharted territory west of the Mississippi River. Some historians have wondered if he fully realized that this expedition would evolve into one of the most profound events in expanding and developing the American character in the early parts of the 19th century. By June 1803, the lands west of the Mississippi became part of the nation as a result of the Louisiana Purchase. As the ink dried on the Louisiana Purchase Agreement, Jefferson dispatched the Corps of Discovery to explore the Missouri River to its source and to determine if any easy route to the Pacific existed. Chosen to lead the expedition were Jefferson's personal secretary, Captain Meriwether Lewis, and Captain William Clark, brother of Revolutionary War hero George Rogers Clark. The extent of Jefferson's and everybody else's ignorance about the interior leaps out from his instructions to the expedition's leaders. He provided the two explorers with letters of credit that would be honored, if the need arose, by American consuls in the South Seas and the Cape of Good Hope half a world away. The expedition set off from the banks of St. Louis and proceeded up the Missouri with 45 men. After wintering in 1804 with the Mandan Indians in the northern plains, they crossed the Rocky Mountains with extreme difficulty in 1805, reaching the Pacific Ocean in January 1806. The expedition returned to St. Louis in September 1806. No easy Northwest Passage was found. The expedition was important in a number of respects. It solidified the United States' claim to the Louisiana Territory. It also gave Easterners a clear idea of what the vast, strange lands west of the Mississippi were like, what resources they contained, and the opportunities they made available to the new nation. One participant of the expedition, John Coulter, went on to become a new breed of American, the Mountain Man, who opened the passes through this untamed land. An early version of the American frontier hero, like the cowboy of the late 1800s, the mountain men were seen as courageous, battling the elements and hostile Indians to tame a wild American country. As a direct result of the Lewis and Clark expedition, reports of abundant fur resources in the Rocky Mountains drove entrepreneurs to set up trading companies, sending mountain men into this vast wilderness. In 1808, John Jacob Astor chartered the American Fur Company in New York. Using ruthless methods to destroy weaker competitors, Astor turned his company into a $1 million corporation, creating the first great American fortune and setting the stage for what 70 years later would be known as the Age of the Robber Barons. Finally, the Lewis and Clark expedition drew the western lands from the Pacific to the Mississippi, closer to being part of the United States. Before there were turbines, before the internal combustion engine, there was the steam engine. The steam engine powered the United States industrialization in the 19th century. But even before that, the steam engine transformed commerce on America's interior waterways. The problem had always been cost-effective shipping. Taking raw materials downstream on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers was relatively easy. However, bringing finished goods inexpensively back to the interior had restricted her growth. That all changed on September 4th, 1807. New Yorkers by the banks of the Hudson River looked with alarm at a boat belching black smoke as it churned upstream through the angry waters. None of the sailors seemed concerned with their ship. Instead, they stood steadily at their posts and watched without apprehension as the captain maneuvered the boat easily without sail. The gathered crowd suddenly realized that what they had thought was a ship in distress was a new kind of craft, a steamboat. On board, the inventor of the steam-powered ship, the Clermont, was Robert Fulton, who later wrote,
"The power of propelling boats by steam is now fully proved. The morning I left New York, there were not perhaps 30 persons in the city who believed that the boat would ever move 1 mile an hour or be of the least utility. Having employed much time, money, and zeal, it gives me, as it will you, great pleasure to see it answer my expectations. It will give a cheap and quick convenience to the merchandise on the Mississippi, Missouri, and other great rivers, which are now laying open their treasures to the enterprise of our countrymen."
Robert Fulton was the embodiment of the future American entrepreneur. He took a dead man's ideas, partnered with an investor to buy the dead man's rights, and turned what everyone else was calling a folly into one of the most meaningful inventions of all times. The investor was Robert Livingston, an influential and well-to-do New Yorker who had helped negotiate the purchase of the Louisiana Territory. At Fulton's urging, Livingston purchased the monopoly of steam power that John Fitch had held in a number of eastern states, and a vast fortune was created. By 1825, as Fulton had predicted, the Ohio and Mississippi rivers teemed with over 170 steamships carrying goods and people up and down the waterways of America's heartland. The steam engine itself was adapted to a variety of industries, and eventually to the locomotive, which would outlast the steamship. It started a pattern of technological innovations that continually re-energized America as they rushed through the nation's economy. Just outside Lafayette in northeast Indiana rises a well-tended monument dedicated to the fallen soldiers of the Battle of Tippecanoe. At this pastoral site, on November 7, 1811, a territorial militia under the command of a future President of the United States, William Henry Harrison, fought one of the most significant and bloody battles in American frontier history. No battle more decided the fate of Native Americans and U.S. westward expansion. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson told Harrison that once the Indians were taught to farm,
they will perceive how useless to them are their extensive forests, and will be willing to pare them off from time to time in exchange for necessaries for their farms and families. To promote this disposition to exchange lands, which they have to spare and we want, we shall push our trading houses and be glad to see the good and influential individuals among them run into debt, because we observe that when these debts get beyond what the individuals can pay, they become willing to lop them off by a cession of lands.
By 1810, Harrison bought over 120 million acres from the Indians. Once owned, the federal government sent out survey teams. It was with the surveyor's compass and chain that the Western movement began. By the fall of 1807, the territory covered by the surveyors stretched from the western border of Pennsylvania to the Mississippi River on the western border of Illinois. 3 future states, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, had been surveyed, and Americans were crossing the Appalachians in great numbers. They entered the area north of the Ohio River, clearing the land for farms and towns. The families who settled here shared the American vision that would become known 40 years later as Manifest Destiny, and which produced an ever-increasing flow of pioneers, pushing the frontier and Indians ever westward. In response to this white encroachment, a Shawnee Indian chief, Tecumseh, attempted to unify his people in defense of their lands. Intelligent, courageous, and humane, he is regarded as one of the greatest native leaders of the pioneer era. In 1806, Tecumseh's brother, called the Prophet, began preaching rejection of white civilization. The brothers founded a community, Prophetstown, at the confluence of the Wabash and Tippecanoe rivers. Tecumseh, infuriated by the land secessions brought about by Harrison's maneuvering of the Indians, organized a confederacy of 12 tribes. He told other tribal leaders,
"One stick can be easily broken, but a bundle of sticks cannot. Let us halt this invading horde of people and their soldiers. Let us reclaim the land and the way of our ancestors."
He advanced the position that land was the common property of all the tribes. "Sell our lands," he asked. "Why not sell the air, the clouds, and the great sea?" When Tecumseh declared the 1809 sale of 3 million acres in Indiana and Illinois invalid, raids began on outlying settlements. In September 1811, Tecumseh visited Harrison in Vincennes, Kentucky, on a trip south. He tried to assure Harrison that there was nothing to be afraid of from the Indians. But after he left, the governor put out a call for troops to move up the Wabash River to Prophetstown. Harrison wrote to the Secretary of War,
Tecumseh is now upon the last round to put a finishing stroke to his work. I hope, however, before his return that a part of the work he considered complete will be demolished, and even its foundation be rooted up.
On September 20, 1811, Harrison began his march north with a militia of 1,200 men made up of Army regulars and volunteers from the Indiana Territory in Kentucky. 42 days later, they reached an encampment 1/2 mile west of Prophetstown. On the morning of November 7th, the Prophet began a walk to the top of a formation later known as Prophet's Rock. The night before, with Tecumseh gone, he had taken charge of the Indians living in the city. He ordered the warriors to sneak up on the militia camp and kill Harrison and his officers. He told them that, leaderless, the militia would scatter. As the plan began to unfold, the Indian surprise attack was uncovered. A bloody, ferocious battle ensued with many deaths and wounded on both sides. Later, Harrison wrote about the battle.
The bark was flying from the trees. The Indians had the best powder and bullets, as well as bow and arrow. At the southern end of the battlefield, the Indian took his last stand.
Harrison and his officers were not killed, and the troops did not disperse as the prophet had foretold. This caused the Indians to retreat. One day later, Harrison's soldiers burned Prophet's town to the ground. The battle marked the end of the tribal confederacy, and with it any hope of thwarting the white man's inevitable expansion west. In retrospect, it was the Indians' last chance to be a partner in the new nation. On a chilly December 16th morning, the Mississippi River, the most important waterway in the nation, rolled backwards, heading north instead of south, in the process swallowing up whole ships.
There was a great shaking of the earth this morning. Tables and chairs turned over and knocked around. All of us knocked out of bed. The roar, I thought, would leave us deaf if we lived. It was not a storm. When you could hear, all you could hear was screams from people and animals. It was the worst thing I have ever witnessed. George Heinrich Christ, Kentucky.
In 1811, for a few short minutes, the earthquake centered near New Madrid, Missouri, shook the nation as it had never shaken before or since. The tremors affected over 1 million square miles of territory and were felt as far east as Charleston, South Carolina, and as far north as Quebec, and caused church bells to ring in Washington, D.C. The fact that most of this land near the epicenter was sparsely inhabited was the only reason the loss of human life was minimal. Even so, the effects of the earthquake were devastating. Pioneering families were left homeless and landless, their dreams shattered. The quake was so powerful that the Mississippi changed course. Settlers who had been on the eastern side of the river in Mississippi Territory working toward statehood suddenly found themselves stranded on the western shore in Indian Territory. The territories and neighboring states did not have the funds to help their citizens recover from this natural disaster. However, once the War of 1812 ended, Congress passed a law in 1815 intended to help Western settlers who had been devastated by the earthquake by allowing them to exchange damaged lands for new land. The Act of Congress was the first time the federal government had undertaken disaster relief on such a national scale and was a precursor to FEMA of the 20th century. When President John Adams moved into the White House of the newly built capital city of Washington, D.C., it was unthinkable that the capital itself would be in flames 14 years later. Surprisingly, with the American capital in the hands of British military forces, the government did not fall, nor did the U.S. surrender as would have been expected. This was one event in a very odd war, a war that did not need to happen, a war that settled very little, the War of 1812. In 1806, the British fleet had a nasty practice of stopping American merchant ships and seizing sailors that they thought had British citizenship or had deserted from the British Navy. This action, called impressment, outraged many Americans and was one of the factors that formed the basis for a war hawk movement within the U.S. government, one that urged the U.S. to take up arms against the British. President Jefferson, however, tried to maintain neutrality with France and Britain through the remaining 3 years of his leadership. He attempted negotiations and signed treaties that had no effect. The impressment issue came to a head in May 1811 when a British frigate seized a native-born American. From that point on, there was no turning away from war. In early June of 1812, buoyed by the war hawks in Congress, James Madison asked Congress for war appropriations. In the United States, the War of 1812, called Mr. Madison's War by New England Federalists, was unpopular with all parts of the nation. Oddly, at the time that war was declared, New England shippers had received a concession from Britain to stop the practice of impressment. There was no reason for war, but the rhetoric of the war hawks prevailed. Playing on the dream of adding the rich lands of Canada to the United States, they convinced the nation that the war could be won with little effort and a minimum of sacrifice. Henry Clay, representative from Kentucky, announced,
"The militia of Kentucky alone are competent to place Montreal and Upper Canada at your feet."
Congress believed him. On June 19, 1812, Madison declared,
"We are at war with Great Britain."
The war itself was fought in 2 theaters: the Western Campaign along the Canadian border, and the constant sea battles and blockades up and down the Atlantic coast. In the beginning, the war went badly for the Americans. The American army was repulsed from Canada by British forces around the Great Lakes. The war's main consequence was to produce new American heroes. General William Harrison successfully defended Fort Meigs, where he encountered his old nemesis, the Shawnee warrior Tecumseh. In a bloody naval battle on Lake Erie, Commodore Perry met the British at Put-in Bay, defeating them decisively. After the battle, Commodore Perry sent his immortal message to Madison.
We have met the enemy, and they are ours.
In 1813, at the Battle of the Thames, Harrison once more met Tecumseh and British forces. This time Tecumseh was killed and the British invasion of the U.S. turned aside. With the Shawnese chief's death, the alliance between U.S. Indians and the British was broken forever. In another strange twist in this odd war, as peace negotiations got underway at Ghent in Belgium, a 5,000-man force of British troops, hardened veterans from the Napoleonic Wars, landed on the shores of Maryland. The Americans were so caught off guard that a 6,000-man force under the command of General William Winder was routed at Bladensburg on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. President Madison and Secretary of State James Monroe watched from an adjacent hill. During the Battle of Bladensburg, Dolly Madison made her mark in history as the heroine of Washington. Now, with the British at the gates of the city, the president's wife organized the safekeeping of hundreds of thousands of official documents important to a young nation. Dolly Madison wrote to a friend,
I have pressed as many cabinet papers into trunks as to fill one carriage. Our private property must be sacrificed, as it is impossible to procure wagons for its transportation.
The capital fell. The city was in flames. But the Americans did not surrender, and just 3 days later, Madison and his entourage returned to the smoldering ruins. In restoring the luster of the presidential mansion in white paint, the dwelling received its name for posterity, the White House. The actual military importance of the burning of Washington was negligible, yet its impact on the American character was deep and lasting. Never before had Americans been so humiliated by the news of the debacle at Washington. It gave rise to a national allegiance much the same as the disasters at Pearl Harbor and the terrorist attack of 9/11 would later. On December 24, 1814, in the historic Belgian town of Ghent, the War of 1812 was ended. Little has changed. Little has been resolved, except the Americans gained West Florida. Oddly, though, the Americans and British would almost immediately begin the process of becoming great allies. Even more oddly, the most significant battle of the war was about to begin. In the fall of 1814, the British, under the command of Sir Edward Pakenham, brought an 8,700-man army into the Gulf of Mexico, near the vital Mississippi port of New Orleans. Alarmed, a brilliant self-trained military genius, Andrew Jackson, took a ragtag force of 6,500 Southern militia men to mount a defense of the port. They arrived at New Orleans on December 1st. After the British landed their troops, Jackson hastily built defensive fortifications out of logs and cotton bales. On January 8, 1815, a short half-hour battle ensued, in which the British were soundly defeated. Over 2,000 British soldiers were killed and Pakenham was mortally wounded, while Jackson's forces suffered only 71 fatalities. It has often been asserted that this battle was fought after the war was ended. But this is not true because a treaty by itself does not end the war. It must be ratified by the governments in power. It is not idle conjecture to suggest that if Britain had won this battle, the Ghent Treaty may have been ignored as a worthless scrap of paper. Regardless, the reverberations were immeasurable. After a dismal showing in much of the war by the Americans, this battle demonstrated once and for all that the United States could stand up to great European world powers. Most importantly, the victory catapulted Jackson into the White House 14 years later, and ushered in the era of Jacksonian democracy, a new ideal that would replace the agrarian utopia of Jefferson with the concept of the self-made man. In 1821, a small group of traders led by the intrepid William Becknell set out from Independence, Missouri in covered wagons to prove it was possible to cross what was known at the time as the Great American Desert. Their destination was Santa Fe, a rich provincial capital of the newly created Mexican Empire. In doing so, they literally laid the tracks in the form of wagon wheel ruts for the Santa Fe Trail. Soon to follow would be more trails crossing the Central Prairies and Western Mountains. Among them were the Oregon Trail, the Mormon Trail, the Overland Trail, and the California Trail. In the year before the Missouri Party completed its 750-mile journey, America had, in one sense, been pinned in by the territory surrounding her. So the land west of the tall grass prairie is where the United States next wanted to affirm its belief in manifest destiny. The Santa Fe and the other covered wagon trails made this possible. The trails themselves eventually stimulated new military, economic, and political activity as they transported American entrepreneurs, merchants, and settlers to new lands. Forts occupied by federal soldiers along the trails were built to protect immigrants and traders from Indians resenting white intrusion upon their hunting grounds. This allowed the federal government to create a military network throughout the West, which made it easier in later years for the government to appropriate Indian and Mexican lands. Trading posts were established to outfit individual immigrant families and the traders. Soon these traders and settlers banded together in large groups called wagon trains, which often extended for over a mile. On a good day, the caravan might cover 12 miles. The trips were hard and full of drudgery, requiring strong men and women capable of withstanding the back-breaking labor of getting to a new land. As one traveler, Susan McGoffin, put it,
"Oh, how gloomy the plains have been to me today. I'm sick, rather sad feeling, and everything around corresponds with them. We have never had such a perfectly dead level before us now. Passed a great many buffalo. Thousands. They crossed our road frequently within 1,000 yards. They are very ugly, ill-shapen things with their long, shaggy hair over their heads."
Many people died along the way as they attempted to reach their western destination. The wagon trails lasted into the 1880s, when they were replaced by the faster and more convenient railroads. Now, only ruts in the ground mark where hundreds of thousands once traveled. It was a remarkable concept, a system of artificial waterways connecting America's vast interior with its Atlantic ports and the world beyond. Started in 1817, the Erie Canal was an engineering marvel, one of the wonders of its day. But it was more than that. The canal system that it engendered would unleash a series of social and economic changes that would transform the young nation. As early as 1797, Robert Fulton, father of the steamship, was advocating to President Washington a canal system. The Erie Canal started at the Hudson River north of Albany, New York, and from there proceeded west until it reached Lake Erie just north of Buffalo. Almost immediately, secondary canals connected to every major city in New York State.
As an organ of communication between the Hudson, Mississippi, the St. Lawrence, the Great Lakes, the North and West, and their tributary rivers, the Erie Canal will create the greatest inland trade ever witnessed. DeWitt Clinton, New York Governor, 1816.
DeWitt Clinton was a tireless promoter of the Erie Canal. Without his vision and drive, the canal would never have gotten off the ground. Canal travel was arduous and slow. Pulled by a team of mules or horses, the 60-foot boats traveled at a peak rate of 4 miles per hour. The constant passing through the locks made the trip even slower. But the placid canal waters made the travel easy compared to the turbulent currents of the rivers and the jolting passages by roads during the same era. Huge tonnages of goods and hundreds of thousands of people moved along the artificial waterways in the next century. With the completion of the Erie Canal in 1825, canal mania swept through the nation as a network of canals interconnecting the country sprang up. But as Governor Clinton predicted, the greatest impact would be on the city of New York.
The city will in course of time become the granary of the world, the emporium of commerce, the seat of manufacturers, the focus of great moneyed operations, and before the revolution of a century, the whole island of Manhattan, covered with inhabitants and replenished with a dense population, will constitute a vast city.
On a federal level, the government was spurred by the success of the state-supported canal systems to increase its role in funding of other infrastructure improvements, including river and road maintenance, leading to the support of all manner of transportation, such as the interstate highway system, railroad, and airline travel in the 21st century.